Hey guys, Miss Erin here. So we are about to start one of my favorite books of all time, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. Now, I have never read the illustrated version, so I am so excited to read this with you guys. So we'll start today, probably read about 10-15 minutes a day until we are through, and I will be showing you the pictures as they come up. Let's open the book and take a look. We got a castle. Cool. A little frog. I bet that's Neville's toad. For those of you that have read this. There's Harry Potter. All stuff. Table of contents coming up. And here's chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. And we can see a picture of the Dursley family over here. Dudley. Alright, let's read. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd ever expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences and spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they ever wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody could discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anybody found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it could be possible. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a very small son too, but they had never ever seen him. Here we go. There's a cat looking at a map on this page. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing up with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday that our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked up his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase and pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little tyke, chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove the corner up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats can't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except for a large order of drills which he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in his usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help but notice there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple young men weren't young at all. Why, the man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never even seen an owl at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's. He had forgotten all about the people in the funny cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly, too. He couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way past them, clutching a large donut in his bag, that he heard a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. All right, we'll stop there. I will continue reading, but it will be on part 2 for today.